Our visiting artist today is a very talented cartoonist from Southern California in Pasadena. That's you.
It's me.
And he has been published by Image Comics, Fantagraphics, No Brow, which are a few reputable publishing comic companies. He got his BA with an emphasis in painting from Azusa Pacific University and has been doing comics ever since. Sure, that's, yeah.
I think that works.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's welcome Malachi Ward.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Patrick. Okay, I think I'm gonna do a little bit of background just on myself first. I, probably like a lot of you, was always really interested in art, and for me in particular, storytelling of different varieties. One of the main things that I really latched onto when I was younger was Calvin and Hobbes. I was really obsessed with Calvin and Hobbes and tried to model my life after Calvin, which was not fantastic for my parents necessarily, but things like that, and things like Star Trek: The Next Generation, and later on reading Ray Bradbury or Flannery O'Connor were all things that made me think that I wanted to do something with visual art or with storytelling. And it was always kind of going back and forth between what I would spend most of my time doing. In college, I decided to pursue painting and gallery art. But even then, my artwork was very narrative. There was a lot of mythology behind the individual pieces. And it wasn't until later in college that I started to pick up comics that were interesting to me and that seemed like they could support something other than a superhero story or the kinds of things that I think most people associate with comics. That started when one of my professors got me a book of Crazy and Ignatz, which is a newspaper strip that was running at the beginning of the 1900s, and at the time was incredibly popular and influential. And it had a very surreal and kind of absurd tone to it that I hadn't really seen anything like that before. And so it appealed to me a lot, and I started going to shops more and thinking that there was an option basically that I could do something like that instead of just trying to pursue gallery art. And that led to going to some conventions. And the thing that struck me immediately was how kind of excited and open everyone was in comparison to a relatively stuffy gallery art world that was not nearly as appealing to me. So I started trying to make comics, and just the decision on the medium was still required a lot of honing in on what it was specifically that I wanted to make. So everything that I was making then was not even very narrative at all, and was very kind of absurd, very much inspired by the Crazy Cat comics that I was reading. And it wasn't until I started listening to the cartoonist Dash Shaw, and he was basically talking about simplifying your style down to something that would make it possible for you to really produce the work that you wanted to, so that you could finish a book. And that was kind of a breakthrough for me, because I kept starting projects and not being able to finish them, and it just, once I simplified the style down to something that was more manageable and there wasn't that psychological mountain of getting a certain number of pages done, I was able to finish a book, and even though I was embarrassed by it and didn't show it to anybody, internally I was now someone that made a comic instead of someone that was trying to make comics, which I think was a pretty big deal. And the next thing that I made was the first comic that I published and was bringing to shows. So the other component to my work is that I work often collaboratively with a friend of mine that also went to school with me, Matt Sheehan, and in comics, there's generally two ways of working. There's the way that's kind of descended from newspaper strip cartoonists and underground comics and zines and art comics and things like that, which is basically that one person does everything. They write and draw, and if there's color, they do that, and they letter it, and from start to finish, they do all of it. And then there's the method that is derived more from comic books, serialized comic books, which is most closely associated with superhero, the genre of superhero comics. And in that, there's someone who writes it and someone who does the pencils. Someone inks that in the days that they needed that kind of thing for reproduction. And color is another person, and lettering is yet another person. So Matt and I publish through the mainstream venues like Image Comics, but we collaborate in a way that's not quite like that, where we're writing together and drawing together as well. So we'll break down the idea into thumbnails, and from there kind of take turns doing passes, kind of editing each other's draftsmanship and storytelling as we go. One of the things that is nice about working collaboratively, especially with something that involves story, is that you can move through bad ideas much faster. I found that if it's up to me, if there's some component of something that I like, even though I know as a whole it's not working, it's much easier for me to hold on to that entire thing because I want it to work. And it's the kind of thing that if I was in the room with Matt, even just me telling him about it and seeing his reaction, I would know immediately that it wasn't really worth pursuing or anything like that. So I think there's an element to collaboration that allows you to work faster, not just because the duties of production are split, but also because it's so much easier to externalize your ideas and immediately have some kind of reaction to that instead of toiling away at it for a longer amount of time before it's shown to somebody else. And then after you've put all this work in, you're less willing to maybe change something. So the main thing, when Matt and I first started, we self-published a series of books that were collected as a book called Expansion. which was science fiction. That was always kind of an element of our storytelling, and my storytelling as well, probably because of watching all that Star Trek when I was a kid. So it's sort of my default language to process ideas, at least when it comes to story. So the first book, Expansion, is something that we were kind of making up as we went along. It originally was supposed to just be, I think it was supposed to be 20 pages, and the story kept kind of getting away from us until it ended up being 150 pages. It's the kind of thing that it doesn't necessarily, it's another one that I feel fine about. But I think it was good for us to figure out the way that we would work together through that project, even if the project itself is not something that I necessarily feel very proud of in the end. So process-wise, it was a success, but in terms of the outcome, it was not something that
it's an amazing book. It's a critically acclaimed.
So one thing that was nice about that book is that we met a lot of other cartoonists and people working in the industry, and started to pick up like pretty good work illustrating for other writers, and getting stuff published in a broader way. That culminated with us working on Ancestor, which was originally serialized in a magazine called Island. And it's basically Matt and I's debut book, since it was the first one to be published on that scale. And it's the one that I think has the clearest vision and has kind of finally, it was the book that I made that I felt proud of, I guess. Which, I mean, let's see. I started in 2009 was when I first self-published a comic, and Ancestor came out in 2016. To give you an idea of kind of the arc of like going from the very beginning of having something finished to feeling like I had kind of not necessarily a mature work, but a piece of work that felt like was of the quality that I wanted it to be. The work itself is integrating a handful of interests and sources that Matt and I both shared. We both have a fascination with the way technology relates to our sense of self, and technology's role in society or any system of society that people place the responsibility of their own betterment on. So the basic story of Ancestor is that there is a Ray Kurzweil or Elon Musk type of a figure, or like a Jack Parsons type of a figure, who is incredibly successful in the field of technology, but also has a almost cult-like following. And in Ancestor, he has an actual cult-like following of people, and they're trying to bring about the singularity, which is the merging of usually artificial intelligence and humans, so that there's a post-human form where we're not necessarily very connected to our bodies or anything like that. and where the horizon of advancement is infinite, so that we're kind of becoming increasingly superior at an exponential rate. Which is an idea that someone like Ray Kurzweil really believes and really thinks is going to happen very soon. So in part, it's a critique of that idea. And then in part, I think we wanted to try and dive into that as it relates to issues of identity, and in this case of the book, anxiety. The main character, Peter Chardin, suffers from anxiety and uses a product that exists in the future that's basically like the internet and social media that is biologically hardwired into you. So everything that you control it through thought, and it's connected to your biological system so that it can monitor brain chemistry in your mind, and it helps him calm down, but it's also something that, because of the endless options for interaction, but that are very controlled by the service, he feels like there's a loss of identity, or there's a loss of self, even though he's kind of dependent on that service. Let's see, sorry. Both characters, Peter Chardin and Whiteside, who's the cult leader, process anxiety in different ways. Whiteside is a narcissist at the level that it would require for someone to think that they're going to bring about the singularity and change humanity forever. So he's someone that is displacing his anxiety on other people and not really taking any sort of responsibility for, or even acknowledging his own anxiety. Everything that he does is everyone else's problem, basically. While Peter internalizes everything. Everything that happens to him is his fault, as he sees it. So it's a conflict of that. This also takes place in the art world, and though Whiteside, the cult leader, is a figure in the world of technology, he has this incredible art collection, which is the reason that he and Peter, who is a sculptor, meet in the first place. The way that they relate to art also says a lot about them, particularly using art as a status symbol. Whiteside has this incredible collection that indicates that he is a successful and important person, but the pieces of his collection are featured throughout the book, and he is expressing himself through the art that he collects, while Peter is expressing himself through the art that he makes. And as the story progresses and the characters take on new forms, Whiteside tries his hand at creating art, essentially, on his own, and this same psychological and emotional problems that he has in the beginning continue to exist and continue to be expressed by the artwork that he's making. Everything that he does is sort of inflicted upon other people. He needs that status as a part of his own identity. Whereas Peter, now with more resources at his disposal, is entering into a purer form of creation that doesn't require the affirmation of external people, external forces of any kind, really. These kinds of themes are things that I think Matt and I have been trying to explore for a little while, and were things that we kind of tested out in the previous book, and were able to congeal them into something that was hopefully a little bit more potent in the new book. Right now, we're working on our next thing. The thing that is kind of a bummer about comics is that they take a really long time. So the next couple years are dedicated to working on the new project, which will hopefully be more about the state and the role of government, but it's through a pretty ridiculous fantasy science fiction story. So that's, I don't know, that's probably too short, but that's basically everything that I've done so far. I feel like I'm just getting started, so I also feel like I don't have that much to say about it. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Or how about this? How familiar are people with comics? Do people read, does anybody read comics very regularly? A few people? One of the things when I was first getting into comics, still like late in college and right after I graduated, was the realization that how versatile comics could be. So I think something that's really fantastic is that there can be all these different forms of expression through comics, and that there's kind of a comic for anyone. They can be as abstract or as kind of locked in a narrative as you want them to be. The thing that I connected with especially was that because there's not a lot of money in comics, it's something that you can exert full creative control over if you want to. So, you know, if you wanted to publish prose or exhibit in a gallery or even make a movie or something like that, there are a lot more thresholds that you need to cross and relationships that you need to have to approve of that and help spread that that work. And in comics, if you make it and post it online or print it up, then you've done it. Like, you're a cartoonist and you've created the work, in my mind, just as legitimately as someone that has some kind of larger publishing deal. So to me, it's the freest way to tell a story. Did you have a question?
Could you take us through your workflow, like in your studio?
Sure, yeah. My workflow, well, so in the concept phase, it's a lot of like being really frustrated and taking walks and stuff like that. that part of it is probably the hardest to quantify, and it's usually happening in between, like while I'm also trying to get something drawn. But basically, there will be some kernel of something that I think has promise, and it's just a matter of waiting for it to bump up against some experience that I'm having in the world and turn into something that I know can be a story. Once that happens, I usually start to write outlines, things like that. But on a day-to-day basis, the process is I get up in the morning, I walk the dog. I take a really long walk with the dog, actually. I take the train to the studio, and I make sure that I have something that's ready to work on. Like it's in a place where I can just jump right in. Usually for me, that means I'm putting ink on a page. I have something printed out for me to work on. It's kind of a mindless but gratifying experience where I don't have to, the stakes are low, basically. I do that for a little bit, and then I do all the stuff I don't want to do, which is like answering emails or loading up files and different things like that. And then I move on to the thing that I also don't like to do, which is doing the pencils, developing the drawing, which for me at least is very like creatively taxing. Like it's the most exhausting part of it, I think, because you can't really, you have to be totally focused on what you're doing. So I basically do that for the rest of the day, and then the way that I work, I pencil in the computer on a Cintiq. I print that out in blue ink, and usually I take that home and then we'll be inking stuff at night, usually while I'm watching TV or something like that. I also color digitally, so usually if I need to be doing something like that, that'll be happening at the studio also. But that's kind of just like the day-to-day drawing system. Any other questions in the jacket?
When you're finished with the book, are you most proud of the narrative behind it or the actual artwork that you created to convey the story that you have?
There have been projects where I'm more proud of the artwork or I'm more proud of the story. Usually the thing that is going to make me feel best about the project as a whole is going to be the story. I think one thing also with comics is that there's very naturally a tendency to think of it as these two kind of discrete things that are combined but are still separate in regards to how you think about them. One being the story or the words, and the other being the artwork. And I think a lot of people that are very good cartoonists think of it that way, but I think that the closer you can get to to using the drawing as a language itself, as your own kind of language, the better those comics will read. So even if the overall kind of what you would think of as the story is pretty separate, that the actual act of reading through panels and how the story flows is hopefully not so much writing and is more a product of that visual language that you've developed. Theoretically, with comics, I think the more integrated those two things are, the better. So with something like Ancestor, I feel pretty good about both components or both sides of that spectrum. Yeah. Some other questions?
So the coloring in Ancestor is amazing.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you do all of your work in full color, and if you could talk a little bit about the pros and cons of working that way.
Yeah. So far, most of the body of my work has been in black and white, and that was just a product of necessity. It's so much cheaper to print in black and white than it is in color. So when I started doing work where I didn't have to handle production myself, I knew that I wanted to try color out, and generally my feeling now is that whenever I can have something in full color, I will, because it's such a huge storytelling tool. One of the things that in Ancestor that we really tried to do is not color, we approach color in two different ways. So there's kind of coloring to reinforce the structure of the page, so that when you're looking at the page from a distance, the color can kind of help emphasize and move you through the visual experience before maybe it's meant to describe like the accurate true color of something. So very rarely are we looking at something and being like, okay, the leaves are green and the building is gray and that kind of thing. We're thinking about, if we have this green thing up in the corner, then that can kind of tie into this green thing that's in the middle that's also on the other side of the spread. The other thing that we do is color to guide the reading experience in terms of emotion. So there will be times where we'll really try and calibrate like say in one part, the saturation, everything kind of through the majority of the sequence is very desaturated blues and grays, and then as the sequence escalates, the colors warm and become increasingly conflicting, so it gets kind of more visually jarring in terms of how we color it. And then we also like to integrate that kind of thought into as much of the reading experience as a whole. So in comics, there's the square with the drawing on it, that's the panel, and then the space in between those squares is the gutter. And one of the things that we did in Ancestor is there's almost like a weird formal subplot that is happening in the gutters where it starts as sort of this yellowish color, and at a certain point the internet service is suppressed and when that happens, the color of the gutter changes, and then as things get progressively worse, the gutters get darker and darker until they're black, and then eventually when the plot turns in a specific way later in the book, there are no gutters and everything is kind of freer form, where it's harder to, how do I say this? There's less of a clear reading order, because there's not that like indication of discrete panels. So it's the kind of thing that hopefully the reader isn't thinking about while they're reading it, but is still taking in that information. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I wondered when you talked about being struck by that idea of simplifying your style and how that helped you, if you could kind of give a sense of what that was, if that's like reducing the amount of detail you're going for, or
yeah. Yeah, before I decided to simplify the drawing style. I really liked this cartoonist, Anders Nilsson, and he had a really beautiful style that had lots of almost like pointillism and lots of little marks, and then he would do, those were interspersed with painted pages. So very labor-intensive stuff, but especially in comics, the aesthetics make a difference, so you always want it to really look as best as possible, or at least it's a pressure that I feel, so that when someone's flipping through, even if they don't necessarily know what the story is, they know that they want to spend some time there because of the way it looks. So there was kind of this internal like struggle, I think, for me, over craft. And basically the artist that I was listening to, I think just on like a podcast or something, was saying that when you're starting out, craft can be a hindrance if you're not able to finish. So the other component of that was that the thing I was working on was, you know, a lot of people when they're starting out, they want to make like their grand opus right off the bat, and that was what I was trying to do. So the idea that I had like a 300-page story and it took me a couple weeks to do a page, it just seemed so daunting. So I had kind of a painted style, and I had like a very like a lot of line work and stuff like that. And basically, yeah, it was just a matter of like, I need to be able to do a page in a day. And if I can do a page in a day, then I can have like the first chapter of this thing done, you know, in a month. And it was just a matter of taking out the lines that didn't need to be there and getting to something that I was even a little uncomfortable with aesthetically, like it didn't necessarily feel complete to me. But I think the other strength of that is, you know, adding on detail and trying to rely on, if it's something like painting or anything that you're using to try and compensate for maybe like a lack of drafting skill or a lack of a style that you're happy with, you don't want to keep that around more than you need to. Like, if you can get down to the bones of what is going to make the drawing right, then that's going to, in the end, that's going to be a better craft approach than trying to pile on a bunch of stuff to make the drawing work. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about making a living as a comics artist, and like at what point you were able to primarily do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's still an ongoing thing. Most of my income comes from freelance illustration and stuff like that, and some freelance graphic design. All of those jobs are things that I got because people saw the comics that I was doing, so it's related still. But in terms of earning a living from publishing comics, it's really difficult, and it's very, very rare. Most people that make comics are making money from something else in addition to what they're working on. So like I was saying before, it's something that is obviously a very big topic of conversation among a lot of cartoonists because it takes so long. Even if you're able to work on it full time, nearly impossible to even get like a minimum wage payment for the amount of time that you're putting into it. But like I was saying, there is a little bit of a plus side to that, where there's a level of freedom that you have when you are not burdened with like how marketable something is going to be, because there is a place in comics where a significant group of people are going to be excited about the thing you make, even if there's not a clear, like, this is a suspense novel, or this is a horror novel, or, you know, things like that. So a lot of the work I make, I don't know, would necessarily be possible to do in another medium. So that it not paying very well in comics almost doesn't make as much of a difference, because I don't think it would fly in like movies or TV or anything else like that either. Anybody else? No?
I guess I just like a quick, I don't know if you can answer it quickly, but you have a BA in art and you sort of focused on painting, and even though that's not the path that you ended up taking specifically, I'm curious if you have just a few sort of positives or parallels that you see, how that degree maybe prepared you for what you're working on today?
Yeah. The program that I was in was not very oriented towards craft. So we were learning a little bit about, you know, this is how you use these tools, and this is how you make a good drawing, and that kind of thing. But it wasn't like if I was going to Art Center or something, which is really intensely craft oriented. The positive side of that was that I feel like I kind of cycled through, and the other people that I was studying with, because it wasn't a big department, were cycling through different conceptual approaches pretty quickly in a way that I think maybe helped me find my voice a little bit faster, even if I didn't know where I was going to use that voice. So I came out of the program thinking I maybe wanted to do comics, but knowing that I had a perspective that was going to be a little bit different than everything else, which in the end is the thing that makes you feel like that's why it's worth being there. Yeah. All right. Are we good? Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. And I also have copies of Ancestor up here if you want to grab one. Yeah.